Well, my name is Matt. I am the pastor of Groups and Outreach here at CrossPoint Church. Pastor Rick was planning on being here with us this morning, but he's gone. His mom suffered a heart attack earlier this week, and she's not doing well, and so he's up north with her. And so if you think about it, you could pray for him and his family as they go and deal with that at the moment. But we are in a series this morning called Life Skills, and excited about that because life skills, we all have a set of them, right? It's our life skills that we have developed, that we're using to navigate our lives and to do our best at thriving in the different contexts in which we find ourselves. So our life skills are what we're using to manage our souls and to do our jobs, to deal with our marriages, to hopefully be successful parents, to have healthy relationships with other people. And the value of those life skills are fairly self-evident. They obviously are like what has brought us to be the people we are today. They're going to determine who we eventually become as we continue to develop. And the quality of our life comes out of our life skills. And when we think about it, too, in relation to our relationship with God, is that our maturing in Christ is due a lot to the life skills that we are using in our lives. Now, it would be nice if we could just simply recognize that we need a life skill and just adopt it. But life skills are typically not just simply acquired, they're developed. They take time and effort and attention in order to become a strength in our life that can help us thrive. For example, when I was thinking about my life and life skills, and one that comes to mind that I had to develop earlier on was that skill of just being able to relate to the opposite sex without doing something stupid. That was something I had to learn. The first date I ever went on was my junior year in high school. And we were going to this dinner, and it was a dress-up type of event. And so we were all dressed up, and I went and picked her up in my 1987 Toyota Corolla, which is probably one of those bland vehicles that man has ever created, right? And so I picked her up, and we headed off, and the first stoplight that we came to, I just went right through it. It was a red light, and I just went right through it because I said the sun was in my eyes, and the sun was shining, but really, I was nervous, and it's never a good idea to put your date in this place where she fears for her life for the rest of the time. But she was tense the entire rest of the drive. Fast forward, a couple of years, there was a girl that I met through a friend that I was really interested in getting to know. This is right at the beginning of my first year of college is about to begin, and I thought she was really attractive, and I didn't have that natural run into each other kind of circumstances with her, and so I was thinking about man, it'd be great if I could have an opportunity to run into her again, and then she worked at the grocery store that was kind of near my house, and so I was I needed a job because I was living in Spokane, Washington at the time, and had been working at a water park, and so that was ending at the end of summer, so I needed a job. So I was I'm going to go in for an application, and she worked at the register in the grocery store, and so I had a plan. My mom was can you pick up a gallon of milk for us while you're out? And so I was sure, I'm going to get that gallon of milk, get in her line if she's there, and be an opportunity for me to run into her again. So I got there. And sure enough, she was there. And I took that as a sign from the Lord that this was meant to be. So I grabbed the application, I got the gallon of milk, I got in her line. I'm so nervous, and I get up to her, and of course, I'm trying to make small talk over, that short period of time that we're together, and it seems to be going. She seems generally excited to be able to see me. She remembers me, and they were yeah, you should get together sometime. She seemed open to that, and so I walked away from that. I'm that went pretty well. I think she's kind of into me. And just I got into my car, and it was, I pulled out, and I was in one of those lanes that you have to drive by the front of the grocery store to leave. So I pull by, and I see her, and she's running out, and she's waving me down. And I thought in that moment, wow, That 1 minute that we were apart, that was too much for her. Like, she needed to know when she was going to be able to see me next. And that's when I noticed, though, in her other hand was a gallon of milk. I had one item that I needed to pick up that day, and I had forgotten it because I was so nervous about being around her. And so I knew that I definitely needed to develop the skill of being able to relate to the opposite sex without doing something stupid. And I think I did pretty well because it's been 15 years and 3 kids, later. But that was definitely one that I had to work on as I was entering into high school and college age. Now, there are many life skills that are important to our lives. Like, there are tons that we're developing. But when we think about what are the most important ones, like the ones that we should put our most attention and effort into making sure are the strong ones in our life, are the ones that have eternal significance. The ones that have to do with our relationship with God and the people that He has designed us to be. Those are the most important ones in our lives. And so over the next 5 weeks, Rick and I are going to be looking at 5 different life skills that are significantly important to us thriving. And these are ones that I know that I've wrestled with and I've struggled through, but I've seen, the value and the importance for my life that I have these be some of the ones that I need to have at my best. And for you, for some of you, you're going to learn some of these, and they're going to be really significant for your life. Some of you, these are skills that you know about, and these next few weeks are opportunities for you to reinvest in those skills because of their value and importance for the people that you are becoming. So where do we start when we start talking about life skills? I think the wisdom says, we should start and we should check in and see, what does God have to say? And God has a lot to say about how we are to live our lives and the plans that He has for us. And God actually speaks about where we need to begin. He actually has something to say about where we start when we think about building our lives. In fact, He says, He declares that there's a starting point for wisdom, a foundation that needs to be laid in order for us to be able to make a life that is filled with wise decisions and choices and direction. And He shares that foundation with us through a man named Solomon. And Solomon, in his own right, was a very wise man because God gave him wisdom that He says was unmatched before him and would be unmatched after him. And so God is speaking through Solomon to us, and he writes a book called Proverbs in the Bible. And it's a compilation of these different proverbs of wisdom, these nuggets of wisdom. And one of them that he writes is Proverbs chapter 9, verse 10. And he writes this proverb. He says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding." Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. So what God is saying here is when you're laying down the starting point, this foundation for being able to live a life that's lived wisely, is that you need to make this decision to have the fear of the Lord drive your life. Like, it needs to be a conscious choice that you've made. Now, generally, when we think about having fear drive our life, that's an unhealthy thing for us to do. Fear is something we usually need to grow past in our life. Like, the quality of your life is going to suffer if you're driven by, say, the fear of failure, or the fear of rejection, or the fear of loneliness can lead you to make some significant mistakes, or the fear of missing out. But there is one kind of fear for sure that is healthy, that we need to nurture in our life, and that is the fear of the Lord. You see, the fear of the Lord is designed to serve as this compass to properly orient your life in the direction that you're going with who God is and His plans that He has for you to be able to thrive and to avoid suffering harm. So what does it mean when we talk about the fear of the Lord? What does that term have to do with us? And what are we supposed to understand about a relationship with Him? Well, when we talk about the fear of the Lord, I think it's best for us to start with the very word itself that's used for fear. And that in the Hebrew is the word yirah. And yirah most commonly means to revere something possessing awesomeness. That's what the word means. So this is not the kind of fear that we have of spiders or snakes or clowns. Because first of all, those things do not possess awesomeness. Second of all, is that we fear those things because we're afraid they're going to harm us. But this is a different kind of fear that's being spoken of. Yirah is the kind of fear that comes from us capturing or getting a picture of the awesomeness of who God is. This understanding of the fear of the Lord is affirmed by the second line in Proverbs, where Solomon writes, "Knowledge of the Holy One is understanding." You see, Proverbs are usually written with patterns, and there's an intentionality to how they're written. So one of the common patterns that is used is parallelism, is that two lines are stated, and they both are saying basically the same thing with a slightly different nuance. It's meant to kind of like expand an idea. And that's what's happening here, is that Solomon is expanding on this idea of what the fear of the Lord is and how it benefits someone. And so we see in this is that the fear of the Lord in the second line is substituted for knowledge of the Holy One. And then the outcome, the beginning of wisdom, is substituted this concept of understanding. And so what Solomon is saying is that to fear the Lord is to know the Lord, like to encounter him, to have an awareness of who he really is. That is the fear of the Lord. And the outcome is that you gain understanding because of that knowledge that you have of who God is. An understanding, and I think he's thinking in very broad terms, an understanding about life. Like what it is all about. What's the meaning of life? How do I live in the context of this reality? This is what he's talking about for understanding. You see, the fear of the Lord, what it does is it takes us to the edge of God's greatness and his glory, and we begin to perceive the awesomeness of who God is. And when we do that, it allows us to be able to have true understanding and wisdom, like a grasp on how life really is and how it's meant to be lived. You see, because what we encounter when we do that is that we see that God is God with a capital G, not a little g. That he's no trivial pursuit, that he cannot be marginalized to the outskirts of our lives. One of the most profound God encounters is what Isaiah experienced in the temple after King Uzziah of Judah died. In Isaiah chapter 6, he describes his encounter with God, and he writes this in verse 1. He says, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord," which is unique, right? Like, wow, he got to see the Lord. And he describes that experience. He says, "High and exalted, seated on a throne." And so his experience of seeing the Lord is that God is like, he is in this place of like reverence, of greatness. He's on a throne in heaven. And it's clear that he's above everything in all people. And it says next, he says, "And the train of his robe filled the temple." You see, a train on a king's robe was a sign of like his nobility or his greatness. And so a great king would obviously have like a slightly longer robe behind him to signify how important he was. And that might be like a few feet behind him. But notice what Isaiah sees about God's robe. And that's why he talks about it, because it is an incredible robe. It's like piles of fabric on top of each other, and it's billowing, and it fills up the entire temple. Is that what God is communicating through his robe is that he is in like this totally other realm when it comes to greatness and awesomeness. That he's breaking the paradigm that Isaiah has of how great a king can be, is that God just is so much greater than anyone has ever been. And he goes on, he says, "Above him were seraphim, each with 6 wings." Those are not native around here, are they? Unique creature shows up only around the presence of God and serving him. And these 6 wings are important because it says next, with 2 wings they cover their faces. The reason they're covering their faces is because of the holiness and glory of God is so intense that they can't look on him. It might remind you if you've read through the Bible, you have some Bible knowledge, and you've experienced some of the stories, is that Moses actually asked one time to be able to see God. And God said, I can't do that for you. Because if you see me in all my glory and holiness, is that it's going to kill you. You'll die from that experience. Instead, he says, here's what I'll do. I'll cover you up and I'll go past you, and then I'll open up the slot of my finger so you can see the trailing end of me. And that's how much of me that you can see, Moses. Is that God is so other than, so brilliant in his purity and holiness, that experience for us who are not holy is that it means death. And so these seraphim, they're covering their faces because of the holiness of God. And it says with two that they're covering their feet, which is a sign of honor and deference to God because they know that he is greater than them. And then with two, they are flying. And they're calling out to one another. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. Now, when we want to put an emphasis on something, we'll throw down an exclamation point on a sentence. But in Hebrew, how they make an emphasis on something is they'll repeat a word twice. And so in here, if it says holy, holy, it's like, hey, this is who God is. Stop and take notice. This is who God is. But if something shows up 3 times, it's like putting something in all caps with multiple exclamation points. It's like, this is a big deal. And what the seraphim are calling out to one another, for the sake of Isaiah to be able to take in about who God is that this is the biggest, most important thing about God, is that he is holy. That he is other than. He's in a whole realm by himself, that he is pure, and that should be the first and most prominent thing that we think of when we think about who God is that God is holy. In verse 4 it says, at the sound of their voices, the doorposts and thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. That this is an overwhelming sensory experience. Like, this is loud, like so loud that it's shaking the entire building in this encounter with who God is. And it's meant to be that way because God is showing Isaiah, he's kind of ripping him from his daily life, his reality, and saying, this is who I am. It's important for you to know who I am. And when Isaiah encounters that, he has an opportunity then to respond to it. And that's what happens in verse 5. He says, woe to me. He says, I am ruined. Like, this is the end of me right now, this experience of God. He says, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. You know, I'm pretty sure that Isaiah knew before this that he had sin in his life, that there was a problem. But I don't think it was like, he didn't see it as like maybe a really big deal, because Isaiah was a prophet. Like, compared to the people, most of the people around him, like, he cared about God and listening to God. And he was a good person. But when he realized how holy and awesome God is, it just put himself in a whole different perspective, that he was able to see himself. And he realized, I'm not okay. The things I've done that are wrong and ways I've broken God's commands, it means the end of me. This is a serious matter. You know, it's if you read on in the story, you see how God provides the answer to Isaiah's problem with his sin, as we know that God has done ultimately through Jesus Christ for us, is that God provides the answer to our issue of when we encounter God's holiness. But I want us to capture this, and as we look at Isaiah and we see his experience with God, is that we perceive that there's a gift that comes with the fear of the Lord and from experiencing God and his awesomeness. And the gift is this: it's humility. It's humility that we are able to gain through that experience. Solomon, in another part of Proverbs 22:4, writes this: Humility is the fear of the Lord. Its wages are riches and honor and life. What he means by that is that humility is this reflexive response when we have the fear of the Lord. It's what comes out when we really experience and know who God is that we are brought to a place where we recognize how big God is and how small we are. You realize that you are not the highest good, that there is someone more worthy. You realize that you cannot play God because there already is a God. You realize you cannot waste your life because there is someone you must live it for. You realize that your whole life must take into account who God is and what his plan, what he desires, and what he has to speak about how you live your life. It's like planting this massive tree right in the middle of your life. And the whole time that you are doing your job or relating to your spouse or planning your finances or organizing and saying this is what we're going to be doing this weekend, is that all of it must take into account who God is. And on one hand, you may say, well, that feels inconvenient. But on the other hand, you could say, well, that's a gift. It's a gift because what it does is it grounds me in reality. You see, when you nurture the fear of the Lord, that's what happens. It grounds you in this reality, whether you want to acknowledge it or not. That is who God is. And so when you fear the Lord, when you take in how awesome he is, it gives you this gift of humility, that it places you in the reality of who God is, and it sets your life on a path to be able to live life as God designed you to live. And that's what Solomon was referring to when he says that the wages of humility are riches and honor and life. Isaiah the prophet echoes what Solomon is saying about the fear of the Lord when he wrote to the Israelites. And he wrote this, he says, he will be a sure foundation for your times. He's talking about God. He says, a rich storehouse of salvation, wisdom, and knowledge. He says, the fear of the Lord is the key to this treasure. You want to unlock God's good plans for your life? It starts with the fear of the Lord in your life. That's where it begins. You know, I have to be honest with you, as profoundly big God is, I'm amazed at my capacity to forget. It's like, not that I forget that God's there, but I have this capacity to forget how great he is. It's like an awareness of his glory and his awesomeness seeps from my life as a constant flow of stresses and activities and grabs from my attention, push it out of focus. And when that happens, the immense glory of God stops carrying the weight that it deserves with me. It's like I know God is great up here, but I fail to really comprehend it down here. And when that happens, what it does is it creates a glory vacuum. And I notice with myself, and you might find this to be true about yourself, is that whenever there's this vacuum, is that I feel it with myself. Is that I begin to give myself you know what? I'm going to give myself that kind of glory. I'm going to give myself the rights to call more of the shots in my life. I give myself more credit for leading than I should. And when we settle into that kind of relationship with God, we set ourselves up to suffer. When I was in high school, I went to Mexico on a mission trip, and the day before we left, we had a fun day at the beach. And so I really, I'm a very white person, as you might have noticed. And so I really wanted to get a suntan before I left Mexico. Now, the nurse on the trip, who also happened to be my mom, said, okay, to me and everybody else, going to the beach, everyone needs to wear sunscreen. Put on sunscreen right when we get there, because the sun is more intense down here in Mexico than it is in Spokane, Washington, where we were from. And the sunlight's going to be reflecting off the water, which is going to intensify it, and you need to apply multiple times. So I took all that wisdom into account, and I rejected it in order to follow Matt's perfect suntan plan, which went like this. I will wait 20 or so minutes before I apply sunscreen when I get there. and allow the sun to begin its good work on my skin. And then I will maybe apply twice. I will only maybe just, I'm certain I'll go with one time and just allow that sun to just have its freedom, to do what it's supposed to do, to tan me. So we get there, and we're about 45 minutes in, and I'm like, oh yeah, the plan. I need to apply sunscreen. A little later on it, but I apply sunscreen. I go back out. We're having fun. Fast forward to the end of our time there. I did not go back and reapply sunscreen either. But I'm like, it will hopefully be okay. Woke up the next day, it was not okay. I was like bright red, and it was so painful. And we're driving back out of Mexico to go all the way back up to Washington State, and we stopped right across the border at McDonald's to eat lunch. And my friend Mark did what all good friends do to a friend that has a sunburn. They hit you, right? So he walked by and he slapped me as hard as he could right here in my chest. And after I got through the pain of 1,000 stinging scorpions on my chest, I felt something weird. So I went to the bathroom and I pulled up my shirt, and there was this huge blister filled with this greenish liquid on my chest. And I was like, thinking in my head, I've been permanently disfigured for life because of Mark. Turns out that a couple hours later, another one developed right here. They match, right? And then on the shoulders, blisters began to form. As large blisters began to form, and they began to just fill up with liquid and fill up with liquid, particularly the ones on the chest. And they became like the size of oranges, and you can imagine the awkwardness that I began to experience because of my decision to go with Matt's perfect suntan plan. And I begged my mom. She's like, we can't pop those because that's an open wound. That's not good. I'm just, please, Mom, for any shred of dignity that I may keep, pop these. And so she drained them for me. And but the next few days were like torture. Putting on a shirt, torture. Trying to sleep, impossible. Riding in a van for 12 hours with people who want to hurt you. Awful. I learned my lesson that day. And now I go by mantras like, if the sun does shine, it's FPF 100 time. My attitude towards that sun that day in Mexico is the attitude I think we develop towards God. When we simply believe in him, but we fail to grasp the awesomeness of who he is. He's there, but we're not really getting all that he is. And we need to take into account how awesome God is. And since fearing the Lord is foundational to our lives for thriving, what we need to do is we need to nurture in our lives the healthy fear of the Lord. And what that means is that we need to continually get ourselves before the presence of God. And that's not just going to happen because we have a conviction this morning, that sounds like a good idea. That happens when we build habits into our life that get us there this week, next week, a month from now, when maybe we're not thinking about it again ever. But it's that habit that keeps taking us back into the presence of God and reminding us how awesome he is. You see, what those habits do is that they act kind of like guides into God's glory. They keep paving that way for us and pulling us along and saying, this is the way. This is how you see and experience God for who he is. So I just want to share with you 3 of those as we close here, 3 guides into God's glory. And there's more than that are out there, but these are 3 that I found helpful for me in getting me into that place where I'm able to once again see who God is and for who he is. So the first one is this. The first guide into God's glory is nature. Some of the best worship times I've experienced have just been me, God, in nature alone. And just taking in how amazing it is of what is around me, like the detail of a flower or the majesty of the mountains, or looking up into the night sky and seeing how many stars there are. And it reminds me how small I am and how big God is. David wrote in Psalm 19, verses 1 through 2, he says, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge." You know, the other day I went out into our backyard, and we have a hammock back there, and I laid down in it and looked up at the cottonwood trees that it hung from, and the sun was shining and the wind was blowing a little bit. It was just a beautiful setting, and I just thought of wow, to think that God made this, and he had no blueprint, nothing to base it off of. And it wasn't even work in the way that I think of work. He spoke it into existence. Just the sheer will and desire for it to exist was enough for something to come out of nothing. And that here I am staring at just a small piece of that creativity that then covers the entire world and in just this vast array of beauty and complexity. And that doesn't even begin when we look up into the sky and we see the stars, and to think that God says, "I named them all, and I can't even number them all. And I'm looking at just one of the many galaxies that exist," and it puts me in that place where I remember how big God is. And you know what I'm talking about because you've experienced that probably for yourself at moments in your life where you're like, wow, I am so small. I am so not capable of doing what God does, and he runs an entire universe. Mark Batterson, a pastor in Washington, D.C., he's a well-known author and speaker. He gives this equation for encountering God. He says, a change of place plus a change of pace equals a change in perspective. That's what getting out in nature does. A lot of times it's a change of place, and it involves a change of pace. And when you do that, you get this change in perspective. You're able to see again the fringes of God's awesomeness and glory. A second guide to think of is posture. I found that my posture leads my heart into how I relate with God. I spend a lot of time praying and worshiping, standing up or sitting down. But it's those times when I can get on my knees before God that it really does help me remember how great he is and put myself in proper perspective. A humble posture of kneeling is straight from the Bible. We see it, Daniel chapter 6, he kneels to pray 3 times a day in his window. And is it really any surprise that when that is illegal and he gets thrown into the lion's den, is that he has no fear about it because of his confidence that the Lord will protect him if that's what God wants to do? Where does that understanding of God being that big come from? I think it comes from constantly humbling himself and remembering how big of a God it is that he serves. We see it also by Ezra. In Ezra 9, he's falling to his knees with hands spread out to the Lord as he begs God to show mercy on his people. We see Paul in Ephesians 3 saying he prays kneeling before the Father. These are incredible men who had this focus and perspective of God and his awesomeness that shaped their whole lives. And where does that come from? Well, I think they just had habits of putting themselves in places that they could reflect on how great God was. And I think their posture matters. I think praying and kneeling at times, maybe it's even, sometimes you see people get down on their face before God, and to be able to call out to God, is that those times matter. I'm not saying you need to do that today, during our next song in this room, though if you want to, go ahead. God never looks down on somebody that humbles himself before him. But what if you were this week were to just plan a time where you got down on your knees and talk to God and allow that posture to help set your heart for who he is? The last guide I want to share with you is silence and solitude. Psalm 46:10 says, "Be still and know that I am God." When he's talking about being still, I think he's not just talking about movement. He's talking about our lips. He's talking about our mind and saying, just stop it all and just take into account that I'm God. Dallas Willard, he's this incredible man of God, author and teacher, writes about silence in his book, The Great Omission, and this is what he writes. Far from being a mere absence, silence allows the reality of God to stand in the midst of your life. God does not ordinarily compete for our attention. In silence, we come to attend. I've come to believe that it's next impossible to truly know God without silence and solitude. And I think that's the reason why so many people fail to really know God with any depth. You know, the digital world we live in has so many benefits to it. But one of the drawbacks is that it makes it easy for us to never be still and to embrace silence. And our souls are starved to be able to cease from that constant stimulation and just be still and know that God is God and who he is. So I encourage you, think about how can I bring silence and solitude into my habits, into the rhythm and flow of my life so that I can know God. I remember clearly when I began to truly gain the fear of the Lord in my life. It was my freshman year in high school, and there were two significant experiences that really helped me begin to grasp how awesome God was and is. And the first was I went on an overnight retreat with other students, and at this retreat there was a revival that broke out, which is a very unique experience. Is that kids just started confessing their sins openly, going forward and confessing their sins and asking God, the Lord for forgiveness and committing their lives to Jesus. And it was the presence of God was just very, you could feel it in the room. It was so powerful during that night, and because of that night, and I said, Lord, I know that you're real, and I begin to get a picture of who you are. I'm going to follow you with my life. I'm going to really pursue you, and that really changed the direction of my life in where I was going. I wasn't a bad kid, but it really did change my whole direction of what I saw was important for life. A little bit later on during that year, my youth pastor gave me a book by R.C. Sproul called The Holiness of God. And he's like, hey, you really should read this. And I began to read it, and part of it was, was looking at Isaiah chapter 6 that we looked at today, and it blew my mind because I was like, I didn't realize this is who God is, like how great he was. It just opened up my mind to begin to realize how vast and awesome God is. And that really had a profound impact upon me and how I viewed life because of that experience. That those two things were really profound in shaping me. So as we close, I want to just leave you with a couple of questions to think about, to consider. The first one is this: have you ever experienced the fear of the Lord in your life? Because if you never have, I want to say, would you ask the Lord? Say, God, I want to know who you are, like really know who you are. Maybe you're coming in here and this is kind of just brand new to you and you're just coming back to God. You know what, God wants to reveal himself to you. And to those who are really eager to see him, God reveals himself. And so it's really powerful for you to be able to just say that and say, God, I want to capture a glimpse of your awesomeness. I want to just begin to be able to see who you are as you really are. Because it's going to change the direction of your life when you encounter who God is. And if you have encountered the fear of the Lord, my next question for you is this: are you continuing to nurture the fear of the Lord in your life? Do you have any habits that are guiding you into his glory? Because that's what you need. You need habits, because that's our hearts drift. Our hearts forget so easily. And we need those habits to keep taking us back and saying, don't forget this is who God is. Don't forget this is who God is. And that will profoundly affect the direction of your life in what you consider valuable, in who you serve, whether it be yourself or if you humble yourself and put yourself and allow God to lead you. And that's the foundational life skill for us, is are we going to nurture the fear of the Lord in our life? Bow your heads with me. Dear Heavenly Father, my prayer is that you would show yourself to us. Reveal your awesomeness to us in different ways, Lord, that we would be people who seek after you and that we would experience clear signs of who you are in your presence, in your power, that we cannot deny that who you are, that's like a tree planted in our life, this giant tree that we cannot get around, but calls for our attention and reminds us this is who God is, and that it would affect the direction of our life, Lord, and set the foundation for what we consider valuable and who we listen to for direction. And Lord, we just want to know you, and that is our desire. We pray this in your name. Amen.